But I really want to talk about cybersecurity threats and prevention and preparation because it's important. Governments of all sizes and all locations are being hit repeatedly around the country by those bad actors out there that are trying to take your stuff. I mean, for the lack of a better term, it's your private, it's your information about your employees, it's information about your citizens, it's everything you can possibly think of they're trying to get their hands on. So let's go ahead. I always have to have a slide about yourself. There I am. But I want to talk about cybersecurity issues and trends. That's how I'll start. Then I'll move on to cybersecurity mitigation tactics. And then we will talk about resources. And I'm actually going to take this and try to make it specific to counties towards the end, things that you should be doing as a county to get ready to go ahead and prepare for what you're in front of. And then we're going to do a virtual Q&A. As Derek said, we're going to talk with each other. And so have your questions ready. Make sure you supply those and we'll go ahead and get those answered as best we can. So let's go ahead and get started. That the attacks are incredible. And as I mentioned, they're happening from all over the world, and they're coming in from so many places they can't even be tracked. But you see, there have been some high profile attacks on government, and what took place in Atlanta, what's taking place in Baltimore and a number of other places where they were ransomed and other, and how do you get your data back and what can you do? And people are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, tens, hundreds, and some have been requested to pay over $1 million. Now, what does that mean? That means you can't get your stuff. You can't get your data. You can't get your systems. And so you're either forced to pay the ransom or you're forced to mitigate that by being prepared. We're going to talk about some of those preparation techniques to make sure when you get hit, you may not have to pay the ransom if you've got proper backups and other redundant systems in place. But these are happening and they're not going to stop anytime soon. Some people thought, well, the pandemic will come along and maybe curb that enthusiasm of the cyber criminals. It actually enhanced their enthusiasm. They found other ways to get in, and they were able to exploit a number of holes that governments needed to get ready for and to take care of. They're also happening all over the country, as I said. You can see this is a map here that shows the ransomware attacks that have been going on in government across the country. And this is an older map. I would say this is springtime, so those dots will be much more filled in. The question is, can you repel them? And then the other question is going to be, when I do get hit, can I ask for help and can someone help me and do what we need to do? So let's go ahead and talk about this, because we believe that cybersecurity is going to have to be more of a service over time. And what's going to happen is there's going to have to be this ability to help each other. There's going to have be this ability to get the right resources from the right people at the right time. So what we need you to be thinking about is, who can you rely on? And if you're not in some sort of agreement with other governments somewhere on how to be prepared, you should be thinking about that. And we'll talk about cybersecurity as a service a bit in a little while. Now, a couple things. One, I love modern technology. I'm big on technology, and people are putting cameras in their homes, and they're putting smart devices all over the place. I mean, I'm sure if I asked everybody how many people had an Alexa or a Dot or one of those other technologies, Google Home, many of you would raise your hands. And the question is, what's happening with those? Are people able to exploit those devices to go ahead and hack you or hack others? And the answer is yes. And that's why you need to make sure the right security protocols are in place. Is your Wi-Fi secure in your home? I mean, I go right down to that level, because we can talk about protecting the government all we want, but you also have this problem in your own home where you could be potentially attacked. So these devices are attacked on a regular basis. And they can do denial of service attacks where they can just slow all the traffic down, or they can potentially allow people in to where you can get data and other resources. So we need to be careful. Having the devices is not a bad thing in many communities, and we'll talk about smart cities in a minute, that many communities will have these devices, and that's a great thing because it enhances the services, but as long as they're protected and as long as they're secure. This was an interesting story that we talked about, and I have to admit, a good friend of mine and our Chief Innovation Officer at this Center for Digital Government is Dustin Heisler. And Dustin is an amazing technology person, and he helped me work on some of this data that I'm going to present to you today. And he found this article about a young person who actually hacked into a Tesla and was able to drive it away. So this is not something that is just to go after data. It could be able also to go after property or to access to things that might be of value to others. So again, this is something that's prolific and it's something to watch for, but there's also controls that are in place to help protect against it. Smart cities, I'm a fan of this. I always have been, internet connected devices, but I've always been on the cautious side of it. And what I mean by that is there's a need to make sure you have everything protected. There's a need to make sure that these aren't just unfettered access devices that people can hack and use for their own purposes. So when you talk to smart city providers or you work with a partner to be able to provide smart city technologies, please make sure that they have the right security protocols in place. Many of them have been working on this for quite some time, but the Internet of Things is real. It's a real possible solution to a number of issues that government may have, but it's also something that you need to make sure you've got protection with. So let's talk about priorities, and cybersecurity is the #1 priority in many cases, and we found that from our research in government, that cybersecurity is the #1 priority for county governments. Let's look at some of the other things on this list, because there's not a thing here that doesn't also have some sort of security component with it. When you talk about the citizen experience, and the pandemic taught us some incredible things, didn't it, about digital experience and the ability to provide digital services to the citizenry, and those need to be secure as well. You also had people that were forced to work remote during the pandemic, and many still are. So how are you actually allowing those people to come in and use services? So you look down this list, you see business intelligence, you see data governance, cloud computing. Cloud computing, while it's 8th on the list, it's still in the top 10. It's been in the top 10 for a while. Many that went into the pandemic and had embraced the cloud or technologies as a service, they did quite well during the pandemic because they were able to have secure remote environments for their people to use. So it's something to think about. But the one I also want to focus on here, just besides cybersecurity, is disaster recovery and continuity of operations. Having a technology disaster recovery plan is awesome, and every government should have one. The question I would have for you is, do you also have a business continuity of operations plan? In other words, if the technology is gone, how do you still run your business? How do you still deliver services? The pandemic highlighted that a bit as well, because if you were forced to work remote but didn't have remote access to your technologies, were you still able to provide services? So there's a number of things you need to be thinking about. But cybersecurity is #1 for a very good reason. I'm a believer that it will always be #1 because this is never going to stop. I equate it to a war that never ends. The battles will happen over and over again. You will win some and you will lose some, but you will never win the war. So you need to be thinking about how you handle that longer term. This has also prompted legislatures and Congress to start acting. There was over 273 bills that were introduced to handle privacy issues and handle cybersecurity issues that were proposed in state legislatures. Now, why is this something to be thinking about? Because sometimes what happens can either make good law or it can make bad law. What you need to make sure of is that you understand what laws have been created and what your responsibilities are if an attack happens. If you lose your data or if you get breached somehow, you are going to have to make sure that you have all the proper reporting requirements. Are you required to provide identity theft protection for people and all the different aspects? So I want you to be careful what you're looking at as far as what laws get passed. You need to make sure that your corporation counsels or whomever you use for your legal work are constantly reviewing those. If it's something that's happening in Lansing that you want to get a hold of before it happens, if you have lobbyists or whatever, you need to be active in this because these directly have an impact on what you're going to have to do as a government going forward. So let's talk about this evolving issue of cybersecurity. And there are a number of states that have done some really cool things. And Arizona's done one where they actually launched a cybersecurity task force, and they are working together across government layers to go ahead and find the right way to battle these cyber attackers. There's also some good work being done in the state of Michigan that there's some work through the state cybersecurity information. Let me say it right. Cyber Information Security Officer. Yeah, I knew I'd get that right. But the CISO's office is also working with local governments. The state police work with local governments. The National Guard works with local governments. The federal government will work hard with local governments through the multi-state information sharing group called the MSISAC, which is free membership, by the way. There's no reason for you to not be a member of the MSISAC. They give you threats that are happening. You can call them when you're in an issue, and they can help you. So these cybersecurity task force are important because it gets people talking, but also make sure you're looking at other resources. And I'll have some resources at the end of the presentation for you as well. New York City did something interesting too, is they actually provided an app out there for New Yorkers to go ahead and see if the Wi-Fi they're using is secure, and or to get alerts that there might be threats. So this is some unique work that's being done out there to make sure citizens stay secure. So one thing to mention here before I get too far too is that if you have a breach or you lose data about your citizens, or if someone's able to hack one of your systems and do nefarious things with it, that impacts your ability to maintain the public trust. So I want you to think carefully about making sure that this is a priority. This is one way that New York City was able to work with their citizens to help make sure that they were staying protected as they use different technologies across the city. So let's talk about some predictions. We think ransomware is going to do nothing but go up, and it's going to hit multiple devices. The more devices that you have, whether they be IoT in your home or they're in your car, or if governments are using IoT, the ransomware will still be an attack that will happen. It was big before the pandemic. It was really big during the pandemic. We just didn't hear a lot about it because the news was preoccupied with everything else that was happening health-wise. And it will be big after the pandemic. This is hundreds of billions of dollars a year where serious actors are getting people to pay ransoms. We're going to talk about ransomware in a little bit and the issue of paying a ransom. And we'll also talk about the issue of having cybersecurity insurance, cyber insurance, which I think is an important aspect for government as well. There's a lot of social engineering that goes on. And when you talk about phishing, or where people are trying to get information from, they're doing it and they're trying to do it as if they know you. So they will contact you, or they will intercept a communication and then get in the middle of it. And we'll talk more about that, where they're going to try to use some of this social engineering to go ahead and get passwords or get access and so on. They're using artificial intelligence. So it's not a 16-year-old sitting in someone's basement. Now, I'm sure there are some of them out there, but many of these are mechanized attacks. What's happening is they're throwing these at you in the hundreds of thousands of attacks, and it's not just the one-off stuff. So I want you to understand that, because it's not something that you can totally stop or totally slow down because it's coming at you so fast, but you have to know it's there. There are protocols and procedures you can put in place, and there's equipment that you can put in place in your data center that can help you manage these mechanized attacks. But what they're trying to do is get information from you. And when they get that information, they're using it against you. And we'll talk more about that as well. The other problem is that in the dark web and out there in cyberspace is they're selling your information. The cyber attackers, what they gather, they sell for a profit. You can see here, they even guarantee the tools. So if someone buys a bunch of data about an entity and the data doesn't work, they actually give them their money back, which I find incredibly crazy, but it's true. And so what happens is this is a whole dark web business that's out there. You need to be monitoring the dark web to find out if your information's sitting out there. And if it is, you need to block the doors and lock the gates on your data access to make sure it's not going any farther. Now, one of the ways you can do that is you can work with providers and partners that can help you monitor that, or there are tools you can put in place, or if you have a chief information security officer, you can go ahead and get them to go ahead to get something done. So you want to make sure you have the right information going forward. And I said it wrong earlier because I'm fumbling a little this morning. It's early, but I said cybersecurity information security. It's actually Chief Information Security Officer, CISO. So if you have one of those in your government entities, that's great. If you don't, then there's time to look and potentially contract for one, or potentially borrow one from a local entity or the state that is willing to help you and share cybersecurity tools. So let's talk about the different types of cyber attacks. And you can see from the schematic, there's a number of them. There's malware, which is nefarious software that gets put onto your technology. And there's ways to block malware and there's ways to track malware. Does it stop everything? No. If we could stop everything, this would be great, but it's just not possible because they keep evolving the malware over time and they keep changing the threats. So they do this by phishing as well. What they'll do is they'll send you an email and want you to click on it. Probably 80% of all cyber attacks have a person component to it. In other words, someone did something. So you need to make sure that you're not clicking on emails that you don't know where they come from. You're not clicking on links from people that you don't know. One of the ways I always can tell, like you get those ones from your bank that say you need to validate your bank account information. Just go up and click on the sender, the one that sent it to you, and you'll see it's a Yahoo or a Gmail account or something of that nature. The banks don't do that. So if you ever have a question when someone sends you something regarding banking, you should always call the actual number to the bank and find out if that email was sent to you. I'll give you a good story. My mortgage company sent something for me to validate. And I am ultimately suspicious now. It's just the way I operate because being exposed to all of this. And so I wouldn't answer it. So I called the bank. I made them go through a validation process with me live on the phone saying it was actually them before I would actually go in to the bank and then adjust my mortgage information. So there's just, I know that's a lot of work and I know it's crazy, but think about the damage that could be done if they steal your identity or they get into your bank account. Some of the attacks that we've seen that have come in to governments too recently that are a bit scary are when they try to change a contractor's bank account. So for instance, you're going to make a payment and they go ahead and want you to change the bank account. A number of governments and educational institutions have fallen for this because they just didn't know any better. They got an email. It says, this is the bank account I want you to submit the payment to. You submit the payment and then it's gone. So that's real and that happens. And a lot of it is because they got phished. They were able to find the right people to send the email or the right people to send the email to or the right information to include in the email. I know that many of you consider transparency very important, and I always did as well. So you might have your contracts that you have with government out online, and they may have the contract administrator on there and their phone number or their information. You might want to redact that from your transparency site because that's another piece of information they can use to combine with whatever they gained when they phished to go ahead and get into your stuff. Now, one more thing about phishing is there's a term that's called whaling. And what whaling is when they go after the executives, they go after the high-ranking people, the mayor, the county executive, the chair of the county commission, whomever it may be. They're going to try to get to that person and use their name to get things done. At Oakland County, we had a number of attempts where people tried to change bank accounts for direct deposit for payroll. So be careful with that. Unemployment insurance, people file fake unemployment claims on people based on information they were able to phish or get from public records. So be careful with that. Man in the middle attacks, this is where they get in the middle of your conversation. So your treasurer's talking to your finance director or they're talking to the bank. They want to get in the middle of that so they can get into that conversation and eventually spoof one end of that or the other to go ahead and get money. DDoS, these are denial of service. What they're doing is flooding your network and just trying to crush your network. So what they're trying to do is stop you from working. So they'll just hit you hundreds of thousands of times, slow your network down to a crawl so people can't use the technologies that you have. Cross-site scripting is actual code that gets put into malicious websites. So what they do is they have a link, and many reputable sites have these problems, by the way, where there's a link on there that says, go off and read this story. It could be a news site. Go off and read this story. You hit it, and it launches a piece of code that could potentially do some damage. And then you have SQL injection attacks, and those are actually where it corrupts the data on your server and it tries to get data out. And this is around credit cards, personal information, and so on. So there's a number of different types of attacks. I know this seems daunting, but with good cybersecurity protocols and procedures, you'll be able to protect yourself. Ransomware, I want to focus on this a little bit because this is the most prevalent right now, is these ransomware attacks are happening all the time. And what they're doing is they're trying to lock up your systems and then force you to pay. Now, if you don't have backups and if you don't have any way to get your information, sometimes paying is an answer. It's not the best answer and you don't want to do it. So one of the ways to prepare for ransomware is to make sure you have really good backups and that your data is in a secure place so you don't lose a lot of data and you can still move your government forward. But important enough too is if you don't pay the ransom and they kill everything, you have to have a way to recover. And what you've seen out there is some governments have not paid the ransom and then spent in the millions to recover their systems to go ahead and go forward. And ransomware is pretty simple. What it does is it phishes users, or it finds a way in, it gets a password, it comes into the file servers and it locks everything up. And then you need to pay the ransom, or you need to get a company to help you negotiate with a ransomer, or use your cybersecurity insurance company, your insurance company is very important. We'll talk about that. But this is a tough one and this is not going away. I use the analogy that you're at a campfire with all your friends and a bear runs into the campfire and then you all run away. And the question is, do I have to outrun the bear? And the answer is no. You have to be faster than the slowest person in your group. I know that's kind of sarcastic, but the point is you don't want to be the slowest person in your group. You don't want to have open access with no controls so people can come in and do this to you because they don't know who you are. They don't know how big you are. They just want your money. So this is not, I'm just going after the big cities or the big governments or the big counties. This is, I'm going to hit anybody that leaves an opening so I can try to ransom them. So be careful. Don't be the slowest person in the group. The pandemic, let's talk about that a little bit. In the pandemic, this is a serious issue, and the risks that were there. There was concern over medical devices in hospitals. There was a lot of email phishing and malware campaigns because people were remote. So it wasn't like you could just walk over next to the next desk and go ahead and talk to somebody and say, hey, did you send this to me? So there was a lot of that. Then there's issues about the connectivity. Was it a VPN, or did you use other resources to go ahead and connect your employees? So this is serious stuff in the COVID-19 era here. And then you also had the issue with telehealth. People were concerned with what could potentially happen when you're actually working with somebody on their health-related issues. So you need to be thinking about this remote work issue, and are your connections secure? Do you have the right way to do that? Do you have a virtual private network for people to come in? Do you have the right tools in place to make sure you can manage their identities and make sure that the right people are using the technologies you have for them? So let's talk about some mitigation. So there's some things that, there's a lot of stuff that exists. And what I want to share with you here is that there are so many different complexities to today's technologies. And if you think about an iPhone, it's kind of funny. They talk about the lunar lander back in the 60s that landed on the moon had less technologies than a smartphone. So everything is computers and everything is on a network. So what do you need to know? That every device could potentially create a hole. Do you have mobile device management where if you are allowing mobile devices to connect to your networks, do you have the ability to manage those? Do you have the ability to manage the identities, and do you have the ability to keep them secure? And then we talked about earlier with the IoT devices, the vulnerability that is there as well. So and every change you make could potentially open a hole too. So I'm a big proponent of change control. So what I mean by that is if you have IT people working on your systems, they need to carefully document every change they made and when they made it. We always used to say in the IT world is if we make something that happens that shouldn't have happened, we need to be able to roll it back. And that my advice to you is you can't roll it back if you don't know when it happened. So when did they make the change? What was the change they made? And if we need to roll back, do I have a prior version that I can roll back to? So make sure that your changes are very well documented and there's a process by which you can do that. And the cyber tools are available, but they aren't always the fix. And there's a ton of them. And everything requires some sort of funding. So when you're looking at technologies, I always tell people, and I talk to the private sector partners all the time, governments aren't going to forklift out everything they have and start over. That's just not going to happen. So what you need are technologies that complement some of the things that you have in place, that are complementary to the tools that you have. That means you should be assessing yourself. And when I was at Oakland County, we created an assessment called SciSafe, and that's available for free on the G2G marketplace at Oakland County. And we used to take that assessment every quarter and make sure that we understood what tools we needed, and then methodically plan out what we use. Because just buying everything all at once and stuffing it in doesn't guarantee that you're not going to get hit or that you're not going to have a problem. Cyber insurance, I recommend it. So I'll give you a great example is when a large county across the nation got hit, we extracted their hit and what it cost them, and then we took it against our population and we put in cyber insurance. Now, Oakland County, we started out at 5 million. I believe they're up to 15 million in cyber insurance. There is a cost to that, but the concern is that if it's so many dollars a record, and at one point some were talking it's over $200 a record in response and recovery costs, how are we going to go ahead and pay for that if we don't have cyber insurance? But you need to have the proper controls in place. You have to understand all your risks, and then more importantly, you have to understand what's actually covered. So if something happens and it's not covered, then why did you have the insurance? So you need to make sure that you're working with somebody. And this is a financial decision that you need to be careful with, that you don't just make it from a technology perspective. This is a requirement of the executive branch and all your leadership and your finance people to be involved with the IT people to make sure you make the right decision. Now, there are some outsourcing opportunities that can help you there. There are companies out there that do really good work in cybersecurity. So do you have the right partners? And there are ways to find out who's doing work. Talk to your neighbors, talk to other governments that you partner with, find the right partner, and you're gonna have to build a relationship and build trust with them to do that. Moving to the cloud, I recommend it. Those that went to the cloud, as I said before, during the pandemic, were better off when they moved to the cloud because their environments were all remote and they were secure. The cloud is just as secure, if not more secure, than your on-premise technologies. So if you're getting a little bit of a pushback on going to the cloud, if any of you are using cloud-based email like Office 365 or Google Mail or any other version, you're already in the cloud. And the security is there, and the providers know how to make sure that you've got the tools that you need. So be thinking about that. Now, this is a framework to go ahead and prepare and respond. So I want to talk about preparation and response now. So let's go ahead and dive into this framework. First, you have to be able to identify what's happening and what's going on in your network. Do you have the right protocols to let people in? Do you have the ability to manage their identities? I mean, if people leave your government, are they still in your network? Do they still have access to your technologies? Or when they leave, do you have protocols in place to make sure that you remove them? You need to have the right policies and procedures in place for cybersecurity. Next, you're gonna protect. You're gonna do all the things you need to do to make sure your technologies aren't vulnerable. I'm not gonna go through this whole list, but one of them I am gonna talk about because I think it's ultimately important. You have to make sure you're patching your technologies. When those patches come out, they need to be looked at from the provider, whatever system you're using. You have to look at them, you have to identify them, you have to look at all the aspects of them, and if they need to be put in now because there's an ultimate threat, then get them in there. Patching can be expensive and it can cost time and resources to do, but if you aren't kept up to date, and there's been some recent hacks on the private sector where some companies weren't up to date, it took them down for 6 months in some cases. You can't be down for 6 months and not have your technologies to be able to provide your services. So what you need to do is make sure you're identifying the things you should be doing and make sure they're there. And all those things on the list here, like access points and email filters and encryption, those are all important things that you should be aware of. Now, some don't really understand. So if you asked a question of a group, and if I asked this group and said, how many of you have ever been attacked or have been hacked in any way? And some will say, yes, we have been, and some will say, no, we never have been, and some will say, I really don't know. Well, the ones that have, yep, probably multiple times. The ones that say no, wrong, you've probably been hacked one way or another at some point in time. And those that don't know, why don't you know? So what you need to be doing is monitoring. You need to make sure that you have up-to-date antivirus. You need to make sure that you have other programs in place that can catch bad actors as they come in. Will you catch everything? The answer is no. At Oakland County, when I was there, we received thousands of emails a day. 85% of the email never made it past the email filter. Never made it past. So we were catching things and dropping them, but if they got through, how were we able to detect them? You need to make sure you have some of those technologies in place. And then the other thing you need to have once you detect it is that you have the ability to respond. It's very important that you're ready when this happens, and that means practice. If you have to do a tabletop exercise, or if you have to exercise any plans you have, do it. Because a plan is only as good as the paper it's written on, and if you're not ready to use it, you won't be able to respond. And it's timely response, because this stuff happens fast, and you need to be ready and go. Then the ability to recover. You need to make sure that you're recovering and you're doing everything you can to make the important backups that you have, the redundant systems in place, everything you need to have there, you need to make sure is in place to make sure that you have the ability to recover. Cyber insurance is important, okay? You need to make sure that your cyber insurance is in place and all the different aspects of it are there. And then always improve your processes and procedures. Never just leave them to chance. This is a NIST framework, and NIST is the national framework, and it talks about different aspects of each of these categories. So don't hesitate to look through this and make sure that you understand what each of these mean, and then make sure that you understand all the different aspects of recovering, responding, and all the information that you need, okay? And like I said, I won't go through all these because there's a number of different aspects, but be familiar with them. I believe that Mac is making this presentation available to all of you in a PDF form. And then if any of you ever have any questions, and I always offer this because I'm a Michigander at heart, even though I've left Oakland County, if you have a question and you want to email me, I can at least put you in touch with somebody that might be able to help you. So. There we go. So let's talk about preparation now. So here's some tips for you about preparing for cyber disasters, okay? You must recognize that the protection of the citizen data is your sole responsibility. And you need to have everybody's cooperation. This is something where you can't leave it to chance. You can't guess at it. Everybody needs to be involved. Your leadership needs to be educated, and you need to be everybody on board. And it has to be a priority. If it's not a priority, you will get caught short on this and you will have a problem. So don't get caught short. Next, treat this like a physical disaster. We're all good at tornadoes and we're good at floods and other things that have happened. Power outages, remember 2003, for those of you that were here? I mean, the whole region went down. So we're good at those. Why aren't we as good at digital disasters? And these attacks are disasters. If you lose your data, it can be very costly. If you have a HIPAA violation, it could be in hundreds of thousands in cost. If you have CJIS violations, or you have PCI, which is payment card industry, CJIS is criminal justice and HIPAA is the healthcare. If you have those violations, they can be a disaster for you. So treat it just like a physical disaster and plan for it and practice for it. Next, examine your current practices for backup and recovery. And this is important because not everybody looks at their backup and recovery as being that important. They think if I have a copy of everything, I'm good. Well, what if I can't recover the copy? So I have all my data on a disk and I have all this stuff ready to go and I have no way to put it into my system because my technologies don't work. So what are your practices? Do you practice offsite data storage? Do you practice every so many months that you get attacked and that you recover? Do you have this ready so that you can respond quickly? And you do this for buildings and vehicles and people. We're constantly thinking about how we're going to recover people, and in case of a physical disaster, we need to do this in a digital disaster as well. Then you need to make sure the right funds are there. And you're going to hear me say funding a number of times here because I do believe that if it's made a priority, you can find the funding you need to make sure that you have the right technologies in place. If you have older technologies, they're more vulnerable. You can put all these doorways in front of older technologies, but eventually people get through the doorway and they get to this vulnerable database that's not protected. So modernizing your technologies will also help you modernize your cybersecurity program as well, because the protocols and everything will be more updated. Look for opportunities to share. Now, work with your neighboring governments. You have sharing agreements with probably bordering governments for different emergencies that might happen. Do you have it for cyber? Do you know a community near you? Like, for instance, in Oakland, we used to send our cybersecurity people out to help smaller governments and even help other counties recover when they would be attacked. Do you know who those people are? And do you have an understanding that if you get hit, they would be welcome to come in and help you? So develop all those relations ahead of time. This is preparation now. So if you have the relationship in place, you can act on it. Just like physically, if you run out of power and you have an emergency generators that can be brought on site, same thing. If you have a digital disaster, do you have digital resources that can be brought on site to help you at the moment's notice? So let's talk a little bit about response now. So remember, one thing, I want you to rack up your questions here, because we are going to do Q&A. And I want to make sure I leave enough time for Q&A. And we talked about 10:45-ish. We're going to break into Q&A, so be ready. So let's talk about response. So this is hard. Some people, they get a little nervous because they didn't see it coming. And they're talking to themselves like, we should have saw it, we should have been ready, we should have spent the money. There's a good chance you can spend millions of dollars and still not see it coming. So what I'm saying is, it's okay. Do everything you can, put the protocols in place you can, make it a priority, do everything you possibly can, but understand it's still gonna hit. It's not if, and it's when. And it's gonna happen so quick that the response needs to be immediate. Do I ask for help right away? Here's another good example. Don't clam up as a government. We get hit, we close ranks, we don't want anybody to know. No, if you have relationships built with people that can help you, you need to tell them right away, get them in the door, get the help you need to make sure you respond quickly. The CIO and the department executives, this is very important because everybody's involved in this. And the problem is sometimes governments don't plan, or they have turnover in their department heads or people that are working with them. If you're not ready to accept that the problem is there, and if you're not ready to respond to it, then you're gonna have a problem. So you need to be constantly educating everybody across all of county government to make sure when this happens, we know, is there a special SWAT team that comes together that analyzes this? Do I have a cybersecurity response plan in place? Am I ready? Do I know who to ask for help? And by the way, everybody's on board and communicated with to make sure that they understand what's happening. And the decisions need to be made at the top. Now, my county was a county executive form of government, so the county executive had the final say in what was happening. Whatever your form of government is, make sure the top person or the top people that make the decisions, especially around funding, are ready to make those decisions on a moment's notice. This has to happen quick. So make sure you have everything ready. Give you a good example. We used to keep P cards, emergency P cards in a fireproof safe, that if something happened, we could give those out to our deputy county executives to go ahead and purchase what we needed. And then they would go right back in the safe after the emergency. So do you have protocols like that in place? Can I get an emergency data center on a truck? Can I get emergency data center space in another government? Can I do that with a private sector partner that I have? So be thinking about those things and be ready to respond in a moment's notice. This one is very important. There needs to be one person that's talking to the media and to the public. And whether if it's the county leader, then they need to have a person that's the single point of contact to gather up the communications, gather up the questions, gather up the information, and make sure that you have one person talking. Because here's what happens. We all know the divide and conquer, where if I don't get my answer from the person I want it from, I'll get it from someone else. You don't want the wrong information getting out at this point in time. There's so much liability here, and there's so much security issues that are wrapped around a cyber incident. You want to make sure that the right information is getting out at the right time. During a physical disaster, when you activate your emergency operations center or you work with other emergency operations people, this is some part of being a trained emergency operations person about who talks to the media, when do they talk to them, how does the information get out, and when does the information get out. The same thing happens here. So make sure you have a really good public relations plan in regard to if you get breached or something happens. All right, so where to start? First, look at the cybersecurity under the lens of everything that we talked about, the enterprise risk management. This is a risk issue. This is not just a cyber issue, it's a risk issue. There is no 100% solution that's gonna protect you, and it requires the attention of everyone. So if you have risk management functions in your county, or if you have someone who's acting like a risk manager, they need to be involved in it as well, because they have to understand the risk. The CFO has to understand the financial risk. All those pieces need to be in place to make sure that you're ready. So make sure you're managing risk and cyber and digital assets together. Next, shared services models. I talked about this before, but get the partnerships in place. Make sure that you have all the different entities inside your government ready to go, and all those relationships are ready so that when this happens, you pull the trigger and everybody goes. People always used to give me a lot of grief at the county because sometimes I would make fast decisions. This is somewhere where contemplative decision-making may not be the best asset, that you need to be able to make a decision, you need to be able to make it quick. So get all this ready. And then you need to evaluate yourself. You need to assess yourself. I mentioned the SciSafe assessment, which is free on Oakland County's GDG Marketplace. There's also national assessments with CISA at the federal level, and the Department of Homeland Security had done a number of things, and the MS-ISAC has done a number of things. Go ahead and get that information, find out what you have, determine what you need, and then get the funding and get the business model together to go ahead and implement. This is your time to make sure you know what you have and how you can battle these cyber attackers when they happen. So let's talk about what this means to counties. And I'll go through this a little quick, but this is something I'm passionate about because that's where I grew up, county government. First, before. These are all the things you need to be thinking about before the incident. Disaster recovery planning, continuity of operations. We talked about all these. Perimeter defenses. What are the walls to stop people getting through? Intrusion defenses. If they do get through the wall, can we stop the intrusion? Monitoring. Do we even know what's happening? Employee training. This should be mandatory employee training that happens either monthly or quarterly at the least. And this training is relatively cheap. It's about $2 a person. So if you haven't been doing training, you should be. And then cybersecurity insurance. These are all the things that you can do before the cyber incident takes place. During, though, number one, stop the attack. You got to stop it, because if it keeps proliferating through your network, it's going to do more damage. Then you go ahead and launch your plans. Finding a partner could be, it's a little bit in between before and during, but finding a partner, if you don't have partners in place, you're going to have to find them then. And then you need to notify people, find the extent of the attack, procure what you need, and then make sure that your cybersecurity provider, if you have insurance, you have to engage them right away. They may have a requirement on what you need to do to go ahead and get payouts from your insurance. Now let's talk about after the incident. So post-attack forensics, how did they get in? Where did they get in? Why did they get in? Can they get in again? All those things need to happen. You need to put the proper plans in to avoid the future attacks. You need to make sure you enhance the defenses around where you may have been vulnerable, and then keep an eye on those defenses as you learn more about new attacks and potentially have to beef them up as well. Then monitoring, all I can say is that needs to be better. It's hard though, but now with artificial intelligence and some machine learning technologies, these monitoring tasks are a lot easier, where it can automatically look at the logs and it can recommend things that happen quickly during the process. And then reevaluate your cybersecurity insurance. If it didn't cover some things, why didn't it? Do I need to enhance my coverage? Do I need to add dollars to my coverage? And what is that going to cost me longer term? These are all important aspects that county governments need to think of as they look at before, during, and after a cyber attack. So I put this in here just because I want to drive the point. Everything has dollar signs to it. So you're going to have to put the right funding to this. It's going to compete with road funding. It's going to compete with everything else that you do, but you need to make sure you're protected and make sure the right money is in place. Some of the resources, here's some links. Again, they're going to give this to you in PDF form, I believe. So you'll be able to go to these links and get some assets from the federal government and state and local agencies. And then there's a NASCIO report, which is the National Association of State CIOs. They actually put out a report about collaboration between state and local government. And then lastly, I actually wrote a document, it's an article, for the Government Finance Review for your finance officers who belong to the GFOA. They get a magazine. In April 2020, I wrote an article about ransomware and everything that you need to do to prepare for, respond, and recover from ransomware. So now I guess we're at our virtual Q&A. So Derek, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen if that works for you.
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, great, Phil, appreciate it. Hang on just a second. This changed my screen. All right, first question.
What's up your technology?
Marlene Bromer. Great information, thank you. I was surprised to hear that Google Mail is safe. We have a local phone company for email. Is that safe?
Now, what you could do, the best way to answer that is the large national systems that are available, they're safe because they have a lot of cybersecurity protocols in place. You can actually ask for those cybersecurity protocols. You can ask them, what security do you have in place? Now you talk about the local email provider, ask them, what protection do you have? What intrusion protection do you have? How are you handling phishing emails? How are you handling different cybersecurity issues? And are you filtering out bad actors and emails and so on? You can ask all those questions. If they can't answer them, then you need a different provider.
Okay, thank you for that answer on that one. Next question, somebody you know pretty well, Shelley Taub. How do tiny counties ever afford this? Is there some state or federal funding to help them?
There is funding out there. Shelley, excellent question. So there are funding opportunities out there for state and local governments, and they can be from the federal level with grants. And there's also, I believe with the CARES Act, you can look at some of the funding that came out of the CARES Act and about how the technology might be impacted by that, especially during the whole pandemic response and everything that happened. Now, one of the best ways to get funding too is to also work and partner with your surrounding governments. You can take 5 small townships and they can look big. You can take 5 small counties and they can look big. If you try to go it alone, you have to take all the expense. If you go with 5 partners, you can share the expense and leverage your dollars across multiple governments to make the technology cheaper longer term.
Okay, great. Ready to take more questions for Phil. Marlene Bromer, we appreciated your answer on her first question. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Does anybody else have questions for Phil? In the interim, while we're waiting for that, Phil, you mentioned ransomware. If memory serves, there were a couple of school districts up or near Otsego County a year or so ago that got hit with ransomware attacks, and I think they both paid their way out of them. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of describe what, say, the hypothetical of a smaller county getting hit with a ransomware attack, how would that play out?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I will never say officially that just pay. That's not the answer. The answer is to make sure you have all the preparations in place so you don't have to pay if it happens, and then you have to be able to close the door. But say, for instance, you just have to pay. There's nothing else you can do. The cost is so exorbitant to get all your data back, or if you have to recreate it, so you pay it. And now there are companies out there that you can work with that will negotiate with the bad actor. And they do this as a service where they'll negotiate the ransom down. So where it might have started at 50,000, it might end up at 5,000. Then it's a financial decision then. Do I pay the 5,000 and get ourselves out of this immediate problem? Or do I go ahead and say no and then spend the money to recreate what we have? Again, that's why it's not just a technology decision, and I don't want anybody to think it is, that the CIO should just make this decision on their own. This requires the finance people and the county executive or the chair of the board to be able to do that. So when you think about how that would work, it would play out all the way through that decision, but there's a time clock that's running too. That if you don't pay the ransom by Wednesday, we're going to lock up all your data. So you need to be thinking about that too. What's this time box that I'm in? The last piece of advice I can give you there is, if you do pay the ransom, say it comes down to where you're just going to pay it, and you don't close the holes that were already exploited, they're coming back. So they know you're going to pay, so they'll come back. Now, if you were able to slam all the doors shut to make sure they couldn't get back in again, and it's going to cost you $5,000, then that's a decision you're going to make with your cyber insurance provider and your contractor, whomever it may be. That's fine. But if you leave the door open again, and this has happened, governments have actually been re-attacked by the same attacker and had to ransom all over again. Don't get into that boat. I don't know how the public will stand for that if you paid and you let yourself get hit again.
Right. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to pose the last question. So, Phil, obviously the theme today has been one of preparation, thinking ahead and preparing for threats that are known, even though sometimes preparation doesn't cover everything. For our smaller members, what, specifically, if you were advising a smaller county, it's like, here's the person that's best positioned to be the day-to-day lead. I mean, I know you mentioned chief information officers. I'm fairly sure many of our smaller members don't have a CIO. So kind of in the interim for that, who do you think would be best positioned to kind of lead the day-to-day?
That's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. Many of the IT operations fall under finance. I would bet that the head of whomever the head of finance is would be a good person if you don't have a dedicated technology professional in the building or in your network. So finance, and then the other piece of this, make sure that whomever it is has got direct connect to whoever's making the final decisions, whether it's the county board or it's the county executive or it's the county administrator, whoever it may be. Make sure they have a direct connect to that person, because again, those decisions have to be made fast. So barring not having any technology people that you can just lean on, I would say that the chief of finance or whoever heads finance would be the best person in the county to make sure it's their responsibility, because it does come down to some dollars and the investment. And if you're the finance person and you see it as a priority, you're more likely to be able to find the money. So that would be my advice.
Okay, thank you again, Phil, for your presentation today and all of the expertise. Just a couple of quick notes. We will be putting Phil's slide deck up on our website at the conclusion of the conference, and the video from today's session will also appear on the website at a future date. We are getting ready to conclude today's activities for the conference. Consult your registration emails and your conference program for details on upcoming days. You can also visit our website at micounties.org. Tomorrow we will resume conference activities with a workshop on how to boost quality of life for Michigan veterans. Before I sign off, once again, I do want to thank our sponsors for the conference who help ensure quality content such as what we had today while keeping costs down for our members. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, Enbridge, MMRMA, Consumers Energy, Mac Service Corp, Michigan County's Workers' Compensation Fund, and 44 North. And with that, we will close out today's activities, and be safe, and we'll see you tomorrow.